director of the Master of International Affairs program, which is part of the Department of Political Science and Philosophy. Our program trains students for international careers in government, the nonprofit sector, and sometimes the private sector as well. If anyone wants to find out more about that program, please feel free to contact me. My email is up there, or to take a look at our website. Since the program was created in 1999, the MIA program has sought to kind of help people in the university community to understand the major challenges facing the United States and the wider world. And of course, one of those challenges is certainly the global trade in illicit drugs. And as I'm sure all of you know, the illicit drug trade is a major scourge in the United States, and it has huge costs in terms of stress that it places, destruction of human lives, but also the cost that it imposes on our healthcare systems and our criminal justice system. And in recent decades, new substances have entered the U.S. market, which, unlike kind of the older ones like marijuana, cocaine, and heroin, are not plant-based. And those synthetic drugs, including methamphetamine and fentanyl, have had devastating impacts on communities in the United States, as probably some of you have direct or at least indirect knowledge of. And today, these drugs are mainly imported into the United States from foreign countries. And in organizing this event, our goal was trying to educate people about, to promote awareness about how that process works, how that international trade works, including the impacts it has outside of the United States, especially in Latin America, where the supply of those drugs mainly comes from today. And so in order to do that, we turned to Dr. Vanda Felbab-Brown, who is a leading expert on illicit industries and non-state armed groups. Since 2017, Dr. Felbab-Brown has worked for the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C., which is one of the nation's top think tanks or research institutions. At Brookings, she is director of the Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors, co-director of the Africa Security Initiative, and a senior fellow of the Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology. Dr. Felbab-Brown has published numerous articles, books, and opinion pieces in the area that she's going to talk to us about today. She appears regularly as a commentator in the national media, testifies to Congress, and serves as an expert witness in criminal trials related to transnational crime and governance. In short, she's pretty much the best possible person to be here today to talk to us about this issue. So please, let's give her a very warm welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Ondati, for the kind introduction and for inviting me. It's really an absolute pleasure to be here. At Brookings, our work is governed by three principles: quality of research, independence of research, and policy impact. And within those three objectives, we very much seek to engage public policymakers, future policymakers, academic colleagues and counterparts on the issues of policy, and seek to get the engagement beyond the coast, beyond the East Coast and the West Coast. So it's really just wonderful to have the opportunity to be here with you in Springfield today. And indeed, as Professor Ondati indicated, the issue that I want to speak with you today about fentanyl and the way it fits into a synthetic drugs revolution sweeping global markets is a dynamic, it's a phenomenon that's affecting the lives of all of us everywhere. The fentanyl crisis in the United States, the metamorphosis or the evolution of the opioid crisis in the country that started in the 1990s, is one of the most severe public health crises facing the United States. And it is the most lethal drug epidemic epidemic ever in history. There have been drug epidemics with a very substantial number of people developing substance use disorders, but nowhere have we seen the death rates that we are seeing in the fentanyl crisis. And although we speak about the fentanyl epidemic with respect to the United States, it's not just a US problem. Canada and Mexico are also suffering from significant fentanyl use problems, with Canada openly disclosing and registering the death rates and problems they are dealing with, very much akin to the United States. Mexico being much more hidden. I'll speak about what's happening in Mexico. But in my view, there are significant dangers that the fentanyl epidemic will not stay confined to North America. There are already signs that that fentanyl is popping up, increasing in Europe. I'll speak about that a little bit. There are some signs that it's emerging in Latin America. And it's part of a larger picture of synthetic drugs like methamphetamines taking over markets in East Asia, Australia, New Zealand, robustly emerging in Europe. That doesn't mean that the old issue of US-Latin American relations, cocaine, has gone away. But it has changed, and it's competing with these other issues. This has dramatically changed US-Latin American relations and the priorities in foreign policy. So, Professor Vanda, I was here 20 years ago, and the topic was counter-narcotics or drugs and US-Latin American relations. It would all be about cocaine, as you well know. And cocaine, coca production would dominate often US relations with countries in the Andean region, Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru, and also transshipment countries, certainly Venezuela, certainly the Caribbean, Jamaica. Often to the point where many policymakers and publics in Latin America would complain and be very unhappy with the fact that drugs dominated the US-Latin American relationship. In a way that involved a lot of competing issues. For significant parts of the Southern Cone, certainly, the issue of migration is far ahead on the agenda than drugs, because the principal source of fentanyl and methamphetamine, the dominant drugs, the most dangerous drugs in the United States, is Mexico. And its connections go to China rather than to the Southern Cone. Nonetheless, as I said, the issues of cocaine have gone away. There are still very dramatic developments surrounding cocaine. Those of you who follow just the news, you've probably seen what's been happening in Ecuador, the dramatic violence there, the emergence of highly violent, very powerful drug trafficking groups, some of which are Ecuadorian, others which are linked to Mexico, and cocaine is still robustly flowing into Europe. And so the work that you are focusing on, issues such as land, access to land, equity, still very much underpin a lot of the dynamics of plant-based production of cocaine, as they did 20 years ago, even as they fit in a very different way into the US drug market and US Latin America relationship. So let me give you some basic data. Over the past 10 years, when the United States started registering the emergence of synthetic opioid, fentanyl, in the US market, we have seen a dramatic escalation of death rates. Essentially, at this point, we are at the stage where tens of thousands of Americans are dying yearly from fentanyl, a number that has steadily gone up. Last year, we have had almost 110,000 Americans. Last year, that is the 2022 data, we don't have the 2023 data. We have had 110,000 Americans dying of fentanyl overdose, dying of overdose, of which the vast majority die of fentanyl overdose. And these fentanyl numbers have been just about doubling or adding by tens of thousands over the past 5 years. And the deaths don't capture the true size of the problem. So many more people have substance use disorder. and many people will overdose and not necessarily die. But that doesn't mean that they are fine. Some might be lucky and can come out of the overdose and essentially be physically okay, but many people who will experience an overdose will suffer lifelong morbidity effects that can be very severe. So experiencing an overdose is no minor issue, even if one does not die. How did we get to this stage? How all of a sudden do we have this break that there is fentanyl and the old 30-year-old problems of cocaine now look so different? Well, the story starts in the 1990s with a legal drug market, a legal market in opioids like oxycodone, with big pharmaceutical companies led by Purdue suggesting that they have developed synthetic opioids that are very different than the traditional opioids, and essentially different in the sense that they don't produce substance use disorder, which in popular parlance is known as addiction. Now, this was false. Very quickly, the companies knew that they were peddling lies along with peddling drugs like oxycodone. That exposure of as little as 14 days or 10 days of steady use would get people addicted. But nonetheless, the machinery that Purdue and other companies developed essentially managed to beguile and co-opt every single regulatory body in the United States, every single type of regulatory entity that was supposed to protect US customers. Whether these were aspects of the Drug Enforcement Administration, whether it was Food and Drug Administration, medical bodies, and individual doctors, with companies like Purdue sending their salespeople to hospitals, to offices, and promising everyone that finally, for the first time, there was a way to deliver palliative care, so treat pain, which is very, very important, including chronic lasting pain in non-terminal patients without developing substance use disorder. Now, this was wrong, but it took the United States false, it was blatant lies, but it took the United States about 15 years to realize that these were lies, and meanwhile, vast scores of people became addicted. Something that an illegal market would never accomplish. And the profile of people who develop substance use disorder also looked very different than the way users have been entering the cocaine or heroin markets up till that point. It was not just young people, teenagers, experiencing, experimenting with drugs, some of whom would go on developing substance use disorders or better. It wasn't just classes of people with various mental health issues who would have high proclivity toward developing substance use disorders, whether it's people with PTSD or vets. All of a sudden, it was your 60, 70-year-old professionals, your 80-year-old grandmothers, your college-age athlete who would be given bags of oxy and told, you find it here for 40 days. So after the 15 years, or take it even longer, after the 15 years of oxycodone and other prescription opioids being shoved down the throats of American customers, all of a sudden we have this massive level of opioid use. We have the opioid crisis. Far more people addicted than an illegal market would ever accomplish. But then further changes start happening in the market. And essentially around 2012, 2013, Chinese businessmen start selling a new synthetic opioid called fentanyl to US customers. And fentanyl is not new. It is also not a prohibited substance. It's a drug, it's a synthetic opioid that's been on the market at least since the 60s. It's a very important drug that is essential for anesthesia. If you have to have a surgery, the odds are very high you'll need to have fentanyl. You don't want to have a surgery without anesthesia. You don't want to have a surgery where you will be missing access to fentanyl. But what happened in the mid-2000s is that far simpler methods of fentanyl were developed that became accessible not just to mass controlled industrial production for the medical process, but that now all kinds of producers could produce, including all kinds of nefarious producers. And so traders in China realized there is this vast demand for opioids in the United States. By the time controls came down, then you go to your dentist's office today and say, I have a toothache, you're not going to walk away with a bag full of oxy, and if you do, you should report that. It's very much against the regulations. But now, so the regulations changed, the markets tightened, the supply, the official legal supply tightened. Here there were these vast numbers of people with addiction, and so Chinese traders start selling in fentanyl. And this starts changing the crisis into its lethal, very lethal phase. So it's no longer just substance use and addiction as a problem, but a lethality. Now, the Mexican cartels in the early 2010s, 2014, 2015, 2016 are the predominant supplier of illicit opioids to the US, like heroin. And for a while, there's this big boost in opioid production in Mexico. And so the two principal cartels, the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco and Nacion, are watching that all of a sudden there's this drug coming in from China, the synthetic opioids that their dealers are selling. And they make a decision essentially to get in on the market. And they become a very important contributor to fentanyl, something that solidifies when, as a result of US diplomacy, China agrees in 2018 to schedule the entire class of fentanyl-type drugs. Now let me back up here a little bit. There are very many important characteristics to synthetic opioids, one of which is that they don't involve plant-based basic chemicals. But the other important thing about synthetic opioids is that they are very easy to change in just minimal molecular structure to retain the qualities that the market seeks, like intense highs, as well as intense proclivity toward addiction. But the edges of the molecule can be changed. And so in synthetic opioids, traffickers and chemists who work for them have this ability to evade regulations by slightly altering the chemical structure of the molecule. The way the international system regulates chemicals and the signs whether they're scheduled or prohibited is by the molecular structure. And so what would be happening in China is there will be one version of fentanyl, called fentanyl analog A, and China would, under US pressures, agree to schedule it. The Chinese producer would slightly tweak the formula. It would no longer look like the initial molecular structure, but it would have still all the same devastating properties, and they would continue legally shipping it from China to the United States, where imports were prohibited, but China would say we can act because this is a different molecule, it's not scheduled. So in 2018, China, after about 6 years of US diplomacy, agrees to schedule the entire class. So any type of drugs whose basic core molecule looks like fentanyl, regardless of the entirety of the molecule structure, is now scheduled in operating. And when that happens, Chinese traders start selling precursor, the basic chemicals, to Mexican cartels that then synthesize fentanyl into fentanyl in Mexico and export it in the United States, which is essentially the state that we have been in for the past several years. Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco and Nacion, the two largest Mexican criminal groups, some of the two most potent drug trafficking groups in history and certainly in around the world and certainly in the Americas, are the principal entities that are synthesizing highly potent methamphetamine and highly potent fentanyl in Mexico from precursor chemicals that come from China. And then they ship them to the United States, to Canada. Now, in this context, supply side control has been an enormous challenge. It's been an enormous challenge over the past year with Mexico because of the kind of partner we have had, or more precisely, we haven't had in the government of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And it's also been a challenge to China. China is the source of the precursor chemicals. And this is a big evolution in US diplomacy, in US foreign policy that used to be essentially dealing with much weaker countries in the basic power relationship dynamic, like in the Andes or even Mexico itself, as opposed to now having to deal with the peer strategic competitor with China as the source of the basic chemicals. At a time when we have, in my view, entered a new Cold War with China. This is not the language that the Biden administration uses, but I think that it is not an unfair characteristic. It's perhaps a tepid Cold War, just not quite like the 1950s of US-Soviet relations, but it's nonetheless deeply entrenched strategic competition with across every dimension of policy that is not going to go away, not going to change in coming years, that's going to be here to last for a considerable amount of time. And so dealing with fentanyl precursors and fentanyl in China has been very different than dealing with cocaine with a country like Bolivia, for example, or even with a country like Colombia. So what have been the challenges with the two countries? Let me start with China, I'll then come to Mexico. China cooperated, as I mentioned, in 2018 when it agreed to schedule the entire class of fentanyl-like drugs. And China, it's important to understand why China did it. This regulation went into effect on May 1st in 2019. China very much prides itself to be the toughest drug law. Its counterpart around the world. The drug policies are highly punitive. Death penalty can still be issued for drug trafficking charges. It's not issued anywhere as frequently as in Iran or Saudi Arabia, but it can still be issued. It often entails highly punitive policies, and there is little scope domestically for strategies such as treatment, certainly something like methadone or heroin maintenance, but even methadone maintenance is very much a taboo in the way it was in the United States until very, very recently. The focus is on punitive approaches towards supply, little acceptance of harm reduction approaches or broader treatment, especially high quality treatment policies. And so in this context, with China very much priding itself on this image and on this policy, and itself often talking about the massive devastation it suffered in the 19th century when it was forced by British military action of the war to legalize the consumption of opium in China. Why would China cooperate with the US on stopping the flows of fentanyl precursors out of China? Well, that's because China subordinates its law enforcement and counter-narcotics cooperation to its basic geostrategic relations and bilateral relationships with other countries. So with countries whom it wants to court, whom it wants to bring into its orbit, such as countries in Southeast Asia, it is willing to extend law enforcement and counter-narcotics cooperation. Often that is highly selective, highly self-serving, incomplete, not a two-way street, but nonetheless it extends cooperation. And countries with whom it has stemmed hostile relationships or where the strategic relationship has deteriorated, not just US, but Australia, for example, it denies the cooperation. So in 2018, in December, at the meeting at the time of President Xi and President Trump, China agreed to schedule fentanyl, the whole class of fentanyl drugs, because it was expecting to be paid back in the Trump administration, reducing the economic tariffs imposed on China. They didn't have it. China was willing to wait a bit longer, kind of gave it a try with the Biden administration and hoped that when the Biden administration would come in, there would be a big warming of China US relationship. That didn't happen either. Not only did the Biden administration not reduce the economic aspect of competition that much, but it significantly intensified it in the military domain, in strategic alliances and their cultivation in the Asia-Pacific region, and across a broad set of technology, restricting Chinese access on microchips, on wide sets of highly sensitive industrial products, undersea cables, kind of pick your sensitive top-level technology that has become an area of intense competition with the US. And so China wasn't getting the warming of the relationship from either Trump or Biden. And by 2021, end of 2021, 2022, started walking back the counter-narcotics cooperation and essentially completely suspended it in 22, something that became publicly declared after then Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, traveled to Taiwan. But the collapse of cooperation preceded that trip, really. Now, what followed then was a year and a half of very intense US diplomacy that finally, in the summer of last year, started getting traction. As the relationship between the two countries deteriorated to the point where there was a lot of concern about potential military confrontation over Taiwan, where essentially the relationship was in free fall in very many domains. You know, we have had the balloon, spy scandal, all kinds of issues were escalating, and China's domestic economic situation was looking far bleaker than China had expected after COVID. Both countries realized that they wanted to stabilize the relationship, that they wanted to put a floor underneath the free fall in the relationship. And so the three issues where some cooperation was seen as being possible became counter-narcotics, fentanyl specifically, AI, and climate. So just last week, there was a big summit between Chinese and US officials in Beijing, specifically focused on fentanyl. This followed the summit between President Xi and President Biden in San Francisco in November, when the two presidents publicly announced and agreed that they would start cooperating on fentanyl once again. And we have seen some initial moves by China. We have seen strong language by Chinese officials embracing cooperation, a big break from the past 2-3 years, where their response would always be, look, Americans, fentanyl has nothing to do with us. It's your corruption, your decadent society, your pharmaceutical companies that are at the core of your death rates. Leave us alone. We have nothing to do with this. So very different language now from Chinese government officials. We have seen some law enforcement actions in China, still very limited, very initial, hardly where we want to be. But there is now commitment to cooperate. You know, if I was to use a fictional dial of 0 cooperation that we have had over the past 2 years, and 10 as the maximum cooperation, say cooperation like we have in Britain, with Britain, or that we would desire, I think we are somewhere between 3 and 4 with China right now. I also don't think that that level of cooperation will necessarily stay. I think it's very vulnerable to another crisis in the relationship, another balloon spy or otherwise going up in the bilateral relationship. Who knows how long it will last during the US presidential campaign and the rhetoric that will focus on it. But nonetheless, we have some willingness to cooperate after we have at 0. We have some strong commitments, all of which is very good. So supply will not fix US problems. Treatment, harm reduction, methadone maintenance, availability of overdose medications, they are crucial, they are inescapable, but they are not enough. So reducing supply, having good law enforcement cooperation is very important, and it has many implications, many positive spillovers beyond simply drugs, something we can explore in the Q&A. But let me focus now on where we are in Mexico, where stunningly the picture is actually worse than in China. Even though Mexico is our neighbor, It's a country where our societies are, our two societies, US and Mexico, are deeply intertwined in familial relationships, in cultural exchanges. A country that is our partner in USMCA and previously NAFTA, and I think that is much, it will be very productive, very desirable. There are many opportunities to strengthen the economic development in the North and integration in the North American space. And yet we have even worse cooperation currently with Mexico. Why? How did we get there? Well, the immediate lack of cooperation, its collapse, comes with the current administration of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who came to office 5 years ago. He will finish in office this year. And he goes by the nickname AMLO. And so AMLO, or López Obrador, came in as a politician very much anchored in sort of Mexico 1950s politics and ideology, where he was deeply resentful and concerned about the level, from his perspective, of intrusion that US law enforcement had in Mexico, the amount of the dirty socks in the drawer that US law enforcement was able to see, and the massive extent to which institutions, individuals, economic entities in Mexico were corrupt and under the thumb of the narcos. And so from the moment he came into office, he wanted to scale back the cooperation. He immediately wanted to end the bilateral security framework known as the Merida Initiative that was the basis of US-Mexico cooperation that was signed in the Calderon administration, 2 presidencies before López Obrador. A whole set of crises in the bilateral relationship followed, like when the US arrested the former Mexican Secretary of Defense, General Salvador Cienfuegos, on drug trafficking charges. Now, this is not a small thing. To arrest the former very, very important top official of a foreign country, not a small country, this is not some small island somewhere in the Caribbean, very important country, on drug trafficking charges, that's a big deal. Well, when that happened, López Obrador and the Mexican military establishment were infuriated and muscled the United States into releasing Cienfuegos. So the US handed Cienfuegos officially to the Mexican government. The Mexican government said they would run their own investigation. The investigation immediately ended, that Cienfuegos was immediately concluded that Cienfuegos was innocent and released them. Nonetheless, that sort of bitterness stayed, and was yet another indication to López Obrador that he did not want to cooperate with the gringos, that the gringos were simply too dangerous in what they were discovering about the extent of corruption and the role and influence of criminal groups in Mexican institutions and politics. López Obrador's own approach was, own strategy, also suggested not to cooperate too much with the Americans. The strategy that he announced earlier when he came to office was something called hacks, not bullets. And that strategy was based essentially around the idea that instead of confronting the cartels with law enforcement approaches that had triggered significant violence in Mexico. When Calderon was in office, he started going after the cartels in what was known as the war against the cartels, that led to the fragmentations of many of them, and just set off murder rates, homicide rates in Mexico. There was a lot of public resentment building up in Mexico over many years that the war on drugs, the war on the cartels, was completely wrong-headed. So AMLO was stepping into the sentiment that the murder rates had to come down, that the policy should be different. And he said, okay, I am not going to have a law enforcement strategy against the cartels. I will instead have socioeconomic programs, handouts to young people in Mexico so they don't become recruited by the cartels. Now, don't get me wrong, I have worked on drug policy for more than 2 decades. And in my work, which was fun to say, I worked on drug policy for 5 years, was fun to say I worked on it for 2 decades, kind of brings my age to my mind. It's no longer so much fun as when I was a student. I across the decades of my work, I have advocated the use of socioeconomic approaches to dealing with the illegal economy, whether we're talking about wildlife trafficking that I work on drugs. But just as the issue of demand is vital but not sufficient, socioeconomic approaches are very important. They need to be built into policies. They need to be well designed. Ambos better. But more importantly, they're not a replacement for law enforcement. You need law enforcement for well-functioning legal economies, just as you need law enforcement for well-functioning illegal economies. And López Obrador essentially gave up on confronting the cartels. He gave them more or less free rein. And what we have seen across his presidency is their significant expansion of their control over territories, people, legal institutions, and legal economies in Mexico. So as Mexico is in the presidential electoral process, in the electoral campaigns, there will be elections in 3 months. There is no doubt in my mind that the narcos, the Sinaloa cartel, Jalisco Nueva Generación, many of the smaller groups, are running around giving candidates bags of money to protect them. And you can ask me in the Q&A about the big scandal breaking out last week about whether President López Obrador's campaign in 2006 got money from the Sinaloa cartel or the Beltran organization. And more dangerously, or even more viciously, also killing and intimidating and eliminating candidates. So when I would go to a place called Michoacán, state in Mexico in 2013, I was told the following story. There were local elections, and someone won local mayorship in one of the municipalities about 3 hours away from the capital, Morelia. And I spoke with that mayor, and he said, look, after I won, the next day, 3 pickup trucks with armed men with big machine guns and assault weapons came to my house and said, we are such and such group. We know who you are, mayor, we know where you live, we're in your living room right now. Here is the amount of your budget you will give us. Here are our license plates of the cars you never stop, never touch, never investigate. Here is what you can do, here is what you cannot do. It's okay if you want to open a X-Y&Z store, for example, but you get it kind of free. And if you don't, there goes your wife and your children. So I said, Mayor, what did you do? And he said, well, I called the capital, Morelia, and I asked for help. And they told me, Tapa, you're on your own, Mayor. And I said, well, what did you do? And he says, well, what do you think? My wife is still here and my children. What do you think I'm doing? So this was 10 years ago. I was back in Michoacán many times since, but in 2022, I was asking, about the dynamics of, actually in 2021, I was asking about the dynamics of the political power of the criminal groups. And I said, does it still work the same way? And one of the mayors says, oh no, now you get bumped off if you run, if you are amazing. So you only get to compete if you can make some sort of deal or accommodation. This was one of the former mayors. So not only do they control the outcomes, they essentially now field or dictate their candidates. So the level of intrusion is far earlier in the electoral process, and it's not confined just to municipal politics. It will also have its equivalents at the state. I am mindful of time. Let me just spend maybe 5 minutes talking about the rest of Latin America and the cocaine market. One of the significant developments with Mexico is also that the 2 largest cartels, Sinaloa and Jalisco, are not confined to Mexico-US operations. They are global entities. They are muscling their way into selling high-quality super potent methamphetamine in Australia and New Zealand, where they are competing against the Chinese triads. Potentially explosive situation that hasn't exploded because the triads tend to be very, very non-violent. They're very much under the whip of the Chinese government, and they don't cross certain lines, such as violence being one of them. The Mexican cartels are developing extensive are developing markets in methamphetamine in Europe. I was going to say extensive. We will yet see how extensive. But all of a sudden, we are seeing countries that haven't had any meth problems, like Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, France, Spain, with meth, essentially driven by the presence of Sinaloa and Jalisco in their operations, sometimes through in cooperation with Turkish criminal groups and Bulgarian and Baltic criminal groups, other times more independently. In East Asia, it is the Chinese triads that are dominating the meth market, the drug that is really far more growing, far more significant as the burgeoning market in comparison to old markets like heroin. But the Mexican cartels are also operating all the way down across the Americas into Chile and the entire space down. Their competition, their bipolar war, has triggered violence levels in places in Latin America that had not seen such violence. Whether this is Costa Rica, whether this is Ecuador, whether this is Chile. Countries where Sinaloa, the pioneer, the more innovative, the voracious capitalist with kind of limitless imagination. Jalisco are the far less imaginative followers in what Sinaloa innovates. So Sinaloa has been developing markets and relations in Ecuador for more than a decade. But the bipolar war between Jalisco and Sinaloa is translating in the Americas in the two cartels trying to force and instigate their local proxies and local Ecuadorian and Colombian criminal groups of operating only with them and not with the other. And this is now generating competition, violent competition, high violence levels in places like Ecuador. The cartels have also been giving their local proxies, their vassals and allies, payments in kind, in cocaine. Now, you can snort cocaine to have fun, but at some point you need some food. So the local proxies need to liquefy the cocaine, they need to make it into money. And that means they need to develop local markets. So whether it's Costa Rica, again, or Chile, or Ecuador, these places that used to call themselves islands of security in the context of often very high homicide rates in the Caribbean, in the Andes, are now all of a sudden suffering both big problems with use, but also significant problems with violence over these local drug markets as the local connections of Sinaloa and Jalisco are developing local markets in order to get cash out of the cocaine which they are. And furthermore, there's a third entity, and that's the Primeiro Comando de Capital, the largest Brazilian criminal gang that has gone international. From the favela, prison boys, local homegrown boys, they are now big international players. They too are competing, though not as violently, with Sinaloa and Jalisco. And one of the issues to watch is at what point will this competition become not just the bipolar war, but the tripolar. But we're not there. The PCC hasn't been as violent and as demanding of exclusiveness, as demanding of local monopolies as Sinaloa and Jalisco have. Now, in this context, coca prices have collapsed in Colombia, starting 2022 and running much into 2023. We are probably just starting to see their stabilization. Now, why did it happen? In the US, the cocaine market has been more or less stable, or maybe slightly declining. The focus is all fentanyl. But the cartels are putting fentanyl into everything. So you want to buy cocaine, very high chance there will be some fentanyl mixtures in it. You want to buy methamphetamine, high chance there is some fentanyl in it. So it is really putting fentanyl into coke that's keeping the coke market alive in the US. The big growth place has been Europe, where cocaine consumption has been increasing significantly, probably hasn't peaked yet. So there's this interesting puzzle I can get into the Q&A about why we have seen the collapse of prices of coca in Colombia, and how long is that going to last. I would posit, and I'll conclude with that we're not going to move to a world where no one will be using cocaine, no one will be using heroin. But the big growth markets, the drugs of choice for traffickers, and consequently the way the drugs will spread in markets is going to be synthetic drugs like fentanyl and newer drugs like xylazine and tranquilizers that are being used like fentanyl and meth. And that's because what is becoming patently visible is that a lot of how drug markets operate is not by what consumers want. Consumers in the US never asked for fentanyl, or at least not in the initial stages of fentanyl. They were often given fentanyl unwittingly by their dealers who were getting it from suppliers. This was a supply-driven market with specific choices that the traders in China and Sinaloa and Jalisco made. And we have seen the same thing about the introduction of methamphetamine into Europe. We are seeing that in the Asian market. Even a place like Afghanistan, one of the poorest countries in the world, where much of the economy was dependent on the growth of opium poppy and production of heroin, has now developed a market in the production of meth. It's not very good meth, it's a plant-based meth. It's made out of a plant called ephedra, which is essentially the same family of plants, such as morning tea, for example. You can store in US parts in the West, and you will find ephedra, such as eucalyptus tea. But so they're using this plant to make crystal meth. It's nowhere as good as the Mexican meth is, nowhere. But nonetheless, it's starting to supply new markets in Africa, in places like Pakistan. For the first time in 2022, Pakistan sees more meth than it sees heroin, despite being on the border of Afghanistan and not so far from Myanmar, another traditional supply. So all of this.
Yes, so you kind of mentioned the case of the mayor in Mexico that, the way you described the case, like, cartel people, as if they were like some entity that no one can touch, basically, they're like above the law. Is it set in that sense that, they are untouchable, they're like above the law, they're in sanctity, or like, is it going completely out of control, or can they actually work on it? Reduce the whole cartel to like some important people, maybe that were trying to do some kind of operation. Is it completely out of question? Are they completely free?
So, unfortunately, rule of law in Mexico is collapsed. That is not completely new. For decades, Mexico struggled with trying to mount effective justice sector, criminal justice sector reform that would release judiciary and police, law enforcement institutions in Mexico from the grip of the cartels. So in the early 1980s is where the politicians in Mexico and the Mexican state, the weakening PRI, the weakening imperial presidency, the very powerful state existed, starts coming apart in the seams, and the narratives started taking the terms to the politicians instead of the few decades where the politicians were taking the terms to the narratives. And at the time, since then, Mexico tries to do a set of law enforcement reforms in just about every administration except the current one. Well, the current one did some as well, it is the national one. And after each set of these reforms, there are stunning, dramatic revelations of the extent of corruption in Mexico. So there's this long history of failed effort to strengthen rule of law, and particularly vis-a-vis criminal groups, criminal entities. But it's become deeply bad over the past 5 years because the government has essentially given up on domestic law. That doesn't mean that zero action is taken. The US tries to pressure Mexico to take action. So at US instigation, the Mexican government arrested Ovidio Guzman, one of the Chapitos sons, extradited him to the United States. A few months ago, again with the provision of US intelligence and US urging, one of the important law enforcement chiefs of the Sinaloa cartel was arrested in Mexico. We tried to persuade the Mexican government to bust fentanyl lamps. There have been massive revelations done by Reuters, stunning investigative journalistic work, that have shown how much the Mexican government over the past few years, has been faking the labs that they bust. And that the actual numbers of labs they dismantle is far smaller than the reality is. And President López Obrador himself goes through periods where he claims there is no fentanyl produced in Mexico, and so why should there be any cooperation? Incidentally, he's also not allowing the distribution of naloxone buprenorphine, the overdose reversing medication in Mexico, because according to him, there is no fentanyl use and no fentanyl related deaths in Mexico. What, however, has been a really distressing shift on top of all that is the extent to which the criminal groups in Sinaloa have been inserting themselves in many domains of life. So I published an investigative report of my own in March 2022 that documented how both cartels, and particularly Sinaloa, have been taking over legal fisheries in Mexico. Not just illegal fishing, something like the Chihuahua, but your basic shrimping, your corvina, your basic legal fisheries for export and internal markets are being eaten alive by the narcos. There is massive penetration of the criminal groups into agriculture, in avocados. You buy an avocado from Mexico, the odds are you contributing financially to the cartels. Legal water distribution within Mexico itself is very much controlled by criminal groups. So whether it's territorial reach, political reach, influence over local decision making, a lot of tobacco and alcohol distribution, sales, stores in Mexico are under control of the cartels. Your mezcalerias, big companies perhaps have enough money to invest in some level of security to minimize or avoid taxation, extortion by the cartels, but many small operators are completely vulnerable. So, I was in Mexico in June and July and again in November, looked at various parts of the countries and asked people about the extent to which they live under narco rule. And what I keep hearing over the past 3 years, 4 years, and again very much so, is people saying, how do we resist? How can we resist the cartel when the government doesn't back us up? So the narcos come and they will say, no, you cannot operate your legal fisheries. Or here, this hotel in Oaxaca, you need to pay us or your hotel will burn down and you will end up dead. We go to the government and they say, that's no problem. So there is currently a tremendous sense of that people have no capacity to resist because they have no right. I am hoping that over time this will translate in popular demand for better security. That people in Mexico will say, enough, we don't want to live under the aggression of the cartels. You government need to step up again. But we're not there. The government, the candidate that is leading in the polls, Claudia Sheinbaum, comes from Morena Party of President López Obrador. She is his close collaborator, associate. She's already been on the record quite explicitly. She will not change the security policies of the country. And so then people look to the US and say, okay, we Mexicans, we businesses in Mexico are either shutting down or have to invest in big security or just yield to the narcos. Well, maybe Washington can help. The US should force the Mexican government to take on the cartels again. Now, the problem is that the Mexican government was taught by the Trump administration that they have a tool that will get them to escape US pressure. And that tool is migration. And as long as we have migration policy that is not fixed, that doesn't provide enough legal job opportunities for people who want to come temporarily to work in the United States, as long as the policy is in the morass that it has been for many years, and we have the big migration flows at the border and their political repercussions, the Mexican government understands full well that they come under drug pressure, go after the cartels, and they say, you're suspending cooperation on keeping third nationals during their asylum processing, or all of a sudden there are become caravans coming to Washington. So, despite the fact that tens of thousands of Americans are dying yearly and tens of thousands of Mexicans are dying yearly, our policy is a straitjacket because of the way that migration is squeezing the capacity of US policy to maneuver, because of the basic unwillingness of the current administration in Mexico, which is the build-up that's been built up to it to ignore the security. Or to essentially hope that the cartels will one day work it out among themselves. They might, but at the cost of Mexico and Mexico.
Do you think there's a way to separate the cultural cocoa market, protect the cocoa market in the Andes from the under refinement factories of cocaine in the States?
So, yes, you have legal markets in the Andes for a long time, particularly Bolivia has always had a legal market for coca chewing. And when Evo Morales became president years ago, it's a man coming out of the Cocaleros movement. He sought to develop other legal markets with cocaine, with coca products. Coca wine, coca soap, coca flour. The problem is they never really took off. They never really generated sufficient interest to be able to absorb the amount of coca we produced in Bolivia alone, not even thinking about the big production in Peru and Colombia. Nor was this a replacement for cocaine. Incidentally, the coca flour is hideously bitter, so no one wants to eat coca-based products out of it, and not even anyone in Bolivia wanted to eat it, so they ended up cooking cookies out of it for school meals, and even the children did not like it, because it's so bitter. So then they had to coat it with sugar to get the children to eat it, which created all kinds of undesirable health consequences of coating all the coca cakes with sugar. And more seriously, so we're at this interesting moment, right, where in the US the cocaine market hasn't collapsed, but that's not where the interest of the market lies. It's been still expanding in Europe. But what will happen if methamphetamine really takes off in Europe, supplied by the Mexico, or with the networks developed by the Mexican cartels that are even building production factories in Europe? And what if fentanyl starts coming in? In Afghanistan, the Taliban has prohibited the cultivation of opium poppy. There's been radical collapse of cultivation by about 90%. The most dramatic reduction in history. Have been devastating economic consequences in already a country with enormous poverty, with more than half of the population in extreme poverty, enormous food insecurity, just a few steps away from starvation. But nonetheless, the Talibs have been very rigid and very committed in keeping the ban going into the second year. We'll see whether it stays across the summer. So far, the indications are people are so afraid of the Taliban they're not cultivating. Now, there is still plenty of heroin in the pipelines, because you always have lags in the market. So even if you stop supply, there is a lag, and there's plenty of heroin buildup, years for mass production. But let's imagine that the Taliban, despite the humanitarian and social consequences, seriously keeps the ban going for another 4 years, or 3 years, 2 years. and all of a sudden there is a heroin drought in Europe. Well, maybe coca and cocaine will replace them, or maybe we will start seeing fentanyl. And if fentanyl and meth take off, maybe that will end the expansion of the cocaine market in Europe. So, we might potentially be in radical changes. Right now, there is still a vast amount of production of coca in the Andes. I mentioned that coca prices just completely collapsed in Colombia, 2023, they're stabilizing. So the government has not been able to take advantage of the low prices to move robustly in with lasting effective alternative livelihoods. Insecurity in Colombia is very high, much higher than in 2016, despite the peace policy of President Gustavo Petro. And also, there are other big cocaine markets now, and that's Brazil and Argentina. They are under-measured, under-spoken about, but it's a reasonable assumption that their per capita consumption is at least as high as US, if not higher. So even if you take out the Europeans, take out the Americans, so they're doing synthetic drugs, there are still big markets in Latin America. So I don't think that we are anywhere close to seeing the cocaine market evaporate. And so, coca flour, coca paste, coca products can make big difference in the lives of individual cocaleros, but really have no capacity to be a replacement for the entire cocaine production.
I think it seems the situation in Mexico is out of control, and in the past few years it has moved from bad to worse. I got to put one of the articles online relative to two major cartels in Mexico and how they really not much power in Mexico. And so my question is, what are the implications of this situation to the global fight against illegal drugs?
Well, I think the implications are really bad because the Mexican cartels have spread their global reach. They are not just operating in Mexico, they are not just operating in the Americas. They are growing, increasing, expanding their presence in Asia, in Africa, and in the Middle East and Europe. Now, in those places, there are many other criminal groups with whom they need to cooperate or compete. It's not like they have an empty canvas and all of a sudden that can grow rain. I mentioned that expansion into the meth markets in Australia and New Zealand is creating real friction with the Chinese triads, and one of the issues to watch is whether this will trigger new violence and the geopolitical implications with China-Mexico relations, for example. But overall, the power of the Mexicans is a really bad, of the Mexican cartels is a really bad story for the world, not just for our immediate neighbor and our public health. And the violence levels in places like Ecuador, the capture of Ecuadorian institutions and their dismantling of the state by local groups, but collaborating with the Mexicans, like the Lobos and like Choneros, is just extraordinary and really, really dismantling, essentially, the vestiges of the state. Yes.
Given the international nature of the fentanyl problem and the problems in Mexico and the relationship with China, is there anything that the U.S. could do policy-wise that would address and reduce the fentanyl problem in the United States? And if there are such things or policies, what are the obstacles to those to achieve that?
So you think in terms of consumption?
I don't know anything. Well, just how can you medicinal consumption? I don't know.
So, so the United States has been trying to reduce the supply by working with the Mexicans, with the Chinese. It's been a struggle, and it's nowhere where we need to be. There's progress with China, no adequate progress with Mexico. So that's on the supply side. We have been doing enforcement side. The Biden administration has elevated fentanyl going after the chapitos, the Sinaloa cartels, to a very important high-level policy. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration has adopted a variety of policies, one of which is called Last Mile, that focuses on dismantling dealer markets, or at least dismantling dealer networks, I should phrase it. And by last July, I want to say the arrest levels were something like 3,000 or in the low thousands, very, very high number in law enforcement standards. That certainly hasn't been enough. On the demand side, policies have evolved in various ways. So the US is no longer the absolutely rigidly doctrinaire government opposed to harm reduction measures. The Biden administration, for the first time in US history, put the word harm reduction in the national drug strategy. There is local level experimentation with something like safe needle exchanges that is generating a lot of local level pushback. Starting really already during the Trump administration, there's been efforts to pilot safe injection sites, still controversial in the US. The big advantage of safe injection site is that if overdose takes place, it can be counteracted very quickly, and it also minimizes the spread of other diseases from needles, hepatitis, for example. There have been significant efforts going back to the Obama administration to improve access to treatment. But 10 years or more, 12, right, since the big, I think correctly, 16 years since the beginning of the Obama administration, we are still in a situation that only 13% of people in the US who want access to treatment can access it. Not 13, 1 3. So 85 plus people, 87% people who want to get treatment for substance use disorders can access it. Because insurance doesn't cover it, because it's not locally available, because the treatment that is locally available is not high quality. A lot of US treatment approaches have for decades centered essentially on abstinence, kind of the equivalent of Alcoholics Anonymous, with the 12 steps. There's been great reluctance to move towards methadone maintenance, even though we know it's very effective. So there's tremendous road here to be traveled to improve treatment. There's much more needs to be done, can be done, and it will make it will save lives, and it will make lives of people with substance use disorder much better. And even in the medical profession, there is kind of much more recognition in the language of people having chronic illness, people living with chronic illness as opposed to more failure. It's been big progress, but that doesn't mean that many doctors are willing or capable of providing adequate medical treatment to people with substance use disorder. A physician might understand, this is chronic illness that the person will have for the rest of her life, but it doesn't mean that they'll necessarily be able to deliver something like that. So much more needs to be done on that. But it's also just not the replacement for the 0-1 supply. Canada, specifically British Columbia and Vancouver, are some of the places in the world that have the most expensive harm and treatment reduction programs. And they also have significant funding. Many people in British Columbia will say we need far more funding. That might not be the case, but they often have more funding for these programs per capita than a lot of other municipalities, a lot of other localities in the United States. And yet their problems with fentanyl and opioids is on par with some of the worst in the United States. Which just shows how the policy is difficult, but needs to include both components. Now, there is many more specific lessons and advice that is available on each of these dimensions. And if you Google the Brookings opioid series, you will find papers on just about every dimension of opioid and fentanyl policy with detailed policy recommendations.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question about the organizations that engage in drug trade. So are these state organizations or do they have fighting because taking over these institutions and markets for and experts is there any foreign influence on it?
In Mexico,
Yes.
so they're very unstable. There is tremendous amount of infighting. They are partially unstable as a result of policies that are adopted, and so the López Obrador administration's withdrawal from law enforcement was a reaction to the war on the cartels that two administrations before President Felipe Calderón adopted. He went on to go after the cartels, arrested and killed, or his law enforcement killed or arrested many, over 150 was the final count, of so-called high-value targets, or people who were important bosses or had important functional responsibilities in the cartels, and then broke up what were, at the beginning of the Calderon administration, about 5-6 important organizations into tens. That generated a tremendous amount of infighting among them, and finally, after about 10-12 years of infighting, two organizations became dominant, Sinaloa and Jalisco. Sinaloa was back to being dominant, or they stopped being dominant. Jalisco were the new group on the block. But there is a lot of small groups. And so a lot of the fighting takes place because local vassals, proxies, allies don't maintain stable relationship with the one group, but they split up because another group entices them to bring a better deal, or because they are trying to be because trying to coerce them to cooperate with them, or to kill them out if they don't cooperate with them. This all is also generating tremendous chaos in their political influence. So one of the reasons why there is a lot of violence and uncertainty is because the bribery channels are not kind of clear and established, like they were through the 80s, maybe into the early 90s. Now you have many people trying to influence local offices, local candidates. There are many people who are fielding or bidding on their own candidates. The fluidity and number of actors, the very fractured multipolar market underneath the bipolarity of the two cartels. By the way, all of you who are IR students know the term multipolar bipolar kind of 101 IR theories that I am sneaking into the drug market discussion. So underneath that bipolarity, there is huge fragmentation, and the multipolar fluidity is a big stimulus of a lot of the violence. But it's the voracious appetite of Sinaloa and its project of taking over legal economies, of building up and accumulating political influence, of diversifying not just into human smuggling or wildlife trafficking, but into agriculture, logging, water distribution in Mexico that's also just generated so much stress on the system, and that is building up the narco governance in narco rule.
So speaking of IR students, I noticed that when you were speaking, I think you mentioned every region but Africa, and I was just wondering if there was any reason for that.
Yeah, just because I ran out of time. So I did speak a little bit into Africa, and I can speak about Africa. So Africa has had drug markets for their own consumption. A place like South Africa has long been both a place with significant heroin consumption, but also a place with all kinds of innovation and production of synthetic drugs, many of which were, I don't to say quite designer synthetic drugs, but many of which were variants that stayed essentially global. There's been a lot of market development in South Africa, and I think there is significant potential for at some point South Africa becoming a much more globally important source of illicit synthetic drugs than has been the case. Up on the East Coast, certainly Kenya has long been an important transshipment place for heroin coming from South Asia, whether it goes into South Africa or would convoluted way sneak its way up into Europe. And Nigerian criminal groups, drug trafficking organizations have also been very important vectors of drug smuggling into Europe, predominantly heroin. And so the relationships between them and Pakistani and Indian smuggling entities goes back decades. One of the big developments came about a decade and a half ago when West Africa became a crucial transshipment loading point for cocaine heading from the southern cone into Europe. So as the European cocaine markets took off, was fostered by the Mexican, Colombian, Brazilian criminal groups to grow, and by Italian criminal groups, the West Africa coast became a major conduit, and there is still massive amount of cocaine that goes through places like Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Nigeria, a lot of the coastal African countries, and some of the Sahelian countries. This has had big local effects in terms of power and growth of various jihadi or local insurgent groups like Tuareg in Mali have been very much able to capitalize on taxing the smuggling of cocaine through the land route. Not all of it was by land, some of it was just reloaded from ships and airplanes and submarines from Latin America. It's reloaded on ships that would, some of it goes by land. So Africa's west coast is a big conduit for cocaine, big cocaine highway onto Europe. There has also been the growth of illicit markets in Africa. Tramadol has been the big problem. Tramadol is a legal opioid, a scheduled opioid. It's a weaker, it's not as powerful as oxycontin. If you go have some sort of procedure, there is reasonable chance you'll be prescribed tramadol for 2 or 3 days, especially for kind of outpatient procedure. It's an opioid, it reduces pain, it calms ones down, it's not as powerful as morphine or oxy. The problem is, and in general, Africa suffers from lack of access to medications, including excruciating lack of access to pediatric care. So about a decade ago, Indian unscrupulous pharma that is in many ways even more unscrupulous and dirtier than the pharmaceutical and chemical industry in China, very political, powerful, started supplying industrial potency tramadol for trafficking. It was totally clear that this was not heading for legitimate uses. The dosage that was being sold was way above human limits. Nonetheless, this was shipped en masse out of India into local buyers in Africa who would then distribute it. So people suffering with poverty, hard work, war trauma would all of a sudden have access to tramadol and became a huge scourge across much of Africa's west, Sahel, in the east. There was pressure by African governments on the government of India to try to turn off the volume. Some actions were taken, it's not at zero, but after allowing it totally to go unmitigated, unchecked for several years, there's been more of an effort by the Indian government. But it's still a very significant issue. Essentially everyone was working tramadol all the time, and this was generating all kinds of highly problematic effects. It's kind of like drinking before they want the water. So that's and in time, we are going to see the bigger establishment of local drug markets. It almost inevitably happens when a place is a transshipment center. In a matter of years, it becomes a place that you have local use as well. Cocaine is expensive in Africa, so no one has been bothering very much to develop cocaine markets in Africa. It's been tramadol, it's been some of the cheap synthetic drugs, it's been heroin. In a matter of time, it will come. And you have actors like the Sinaloa cartel building up smuggling networks of precursors heading from China to Africa to them, even of migrants, smuggling channels from Africa, especially as Europe is adopting very harsh policies against migrants, shutting down access to asylum. And in a matter of time, we will see more substance use pressure, more supply to create markets in Africa as well.
I think puzzled by the situation that you referred to the United States arresting former Secretary of Defense Secretaries and then dropping charges. And I was just wondering, why would they make such a move that was sure to generate huge outcry in Mexico? And since it does, so we need to back off and let him go. I mean, why was there some kind of miscommunication or change? What was behind that?
So the story is that the Justice Department acted without adequately vetting it with other institutions, with other counterparts like the State Department. That's possible, but there are important control mechanisms, such as sensitive activities review committee that involves multiple institutions. So that committee authorizes situations like this for the VA, and its level of robustness varies by administration. So it's possible that the SARC at the time was not doing a lot of homework with the State Department. I think that what I think more likely, or kind of more importantly than whatever layer of communications and interagency vetting than that or not, what caught the administration by surprise was the extent to which AMLO would react. I think there was profound underappreciation of how much López Obrador has embraced or had embraced already at the time the Mexican military as his principal agent and actor for the administration of all policy, not just security policy, but critical infrastructure building, any domain of policy. Essentially, AMLO has tried to liquidate institutions and done so very effectively across a wide range of institutions by firing people, by reducing their salaries, by cutting budgets by 90%, and handing all of the implementation or a lot of implementation of public policy to the military. So when Cienfuegos is arrested in 2020, I think that the US government was caught off guard with how much AMLO has come to depend and embrace the military. So Cienfuegos had been retired, and they thought, well, he's retired, this is not going to generate the same excitement as if we were arresting an acting minister and acting Secretary of Defense. And then AMLO says, okay, if you don't hand us, if you don't give it back to us, I will stop all cooperation. No more Merida, no more bicentennial framework, no nothing. All security, US security law enforcement agents are out of Mexico. Nothing. I mean, he presents kind of the nuclear option, and he threatens migration. And of course, migration was what bandaged Morales to the Trump administration. And so they backed off, they handed Cienfuegos back. And then just drove the lesson to AMLO that if he pulls the migration card, he can get away with all of this.
So I have a question that's more I guess, how did you end up at the Brookings Institute? I read that you have a PhD and a bachelor's, but what was your career journey to where you are now?
Okay, we have 3 minutes. So we're going to cut into the stories. So I did my undergrad at Harvard in the 1990s. And it was the Cold War had ended. It was several years after the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union collapsed. The issues that dominated international relations for decades all of a sudden seemed over. And new issues like drugs were rising. We were in the creation of what was Plan Colombia. So there were these new issues, and the geopolitical space was very different. So when I was at Harvard, I ended up writing a senior thesis on the Islamist movement in Algeria that won elections but was not allowed to come take office. The government prohibited it, started arresting leaders, and set off a vicious civil war in Algeria that became the breeding ground for a lot of terrorist groups. And it was a reference point and a physical place where a lot of terrorist groups met. And as I was doing research on that project, I came to realize that a lot of Islamist insurgency groups or armed Islamist actors were also involved in the drug trade, like the Taliban, which is stunning, right? Because people thought about it with respect to Colombia, they thought about it with respect to Peru and the shining path. But for the Islamist group, this was totally haram. I thought, well, this is kind of puzzling. And even though this was not the thrust of direction at all of my thesis, I was focused on that. And then I went to get my PhD at MIT, and I suggested a heretical topic, which was to work on the relationship between insurgencies and illicit economies at the time when insurgencies seemed completely moot. This was September 2020, before 9/11. And so it seems like they've gone with the wind, the Cold War wind seemed like forever away. And the reaction I got was, look, insurgency is totally passé, illicit economy is totally marginal, find yourself a different topic. And I said, no, I want to do something. And I'm sticking with this topic. And of course, a year later, you had 9/11. And even though I was early in my PhD, I soon was one of the people who in depth about the Taliban and the Free Puppy. And I ended up being very early plugged into the policy community, advising on counter-narcotics, counter-insurgency policies in Afghanistan. I knew before I started my PhD that I wanted to go into policy. So that was always my objective and focus. I wrote the policy focus dissertation, was doing consulting before I got my PhD. And of course, working at Brookings was just terrific because of the enormous quality and independence of scholarship.
I think we're out of time, and I think probably one more question.
Especially if it's a yes or no.
Okay, I know that it's difficult to work with a country that has the kind of problems, like cartels having this big power in the nation. So my question is, in your point of view, what would be a first step for a solution for this problem?
Sorry, I didn't catch the beginning. What would be the first step to the solution in Mexico?
In government as Mexico.
Governments like Mexico.
Yeah.
Look, I think that the first step and the most important step is for publics to demand that the government, not the criminals, deliver security to them. That is hard because the governments might be reluctant to do so across various parts of Latin America, various parts of the world. Governments have long been happy or willing to relegate people, territories to be governed by non-government entities. And it's hard in a place where demands for accountability, we're speaking against violent actors, whether they are armed criminal groups or whether they are armed politically motivated groups. I understand how hard it is. But if the demand doesn't come internally, there is only so much externally that partners like the United States can instigate. So it is, Mexico needs to reach this inflection point that people will say, enough, Mr. President, Mrs. President, might be Mrs. next time. We want the state to give us security. And we want the state to be accountable.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.